Ladies and gentlemen, was India subjected to CIA interference in the Nehru era? And did Nehru as Prime Minister succumb to pressure from the United States? Historian Paul McGarr's explosive claims have now blown the lid over what could have possibly been interference from the US in India's affairs. Historian Paul McGarr reveals that the US viewed Jawaharlal Nehru as a fading, inconsistent leader by the early 1960s. Now, he claims that Washington kept a close eye on India by allegedly infiltrating Nehru's inner circle and intercepting sensitive documents, all while navigating a complex diplomatic dance with a non-allied Indian government. Paul McGarr has also claimed that evidence seems to suggest that US and British intelligence successfully penetrated at the highest levels of the Indian government. He further claims that the US managed to get access to Nehru's private thoughts and goals through some of the highest officials in office back then. Further, this historian has also spoken about some covert campaigns led by the CIA within Indian soil. Here's what he has claimed. The first revelation: CIA implemented covert action campaign here in India. The second, that there was a bid as far as this entire matter is concerned to destabilize and remove the communist government in Kerala. Third, the CIA did so with the full knowledge of power brokers within the Congress party. And these, of course, are some of the sensational claims. There are many more that he's being made. We're now joined by Paul McGarr himself, who not only is a historian, but is also someone who follows the intelligence world very closely. I'd like to thank you, Mr. Paul McGarr, for joining us and speaking to us here on Times Now. Let me begin by asking you, you've been reported to have written, and I quote, "It can be safely assumed that from 1946 to 1959, the CIA had access to every paper passing through Nehru's Secretariat. This is borderline incendiary. What makes you believe this?"
Well, really, that's based on information from Mathai, who was Nehru's personal secretary, who's, after he left office under something of a cloud and amid a scandal, it came out that really there was very strong evidence. So we don't know this definitively, but there is very strong evidence that Mathai was in the pay of American intelligence agencies, most like the Central Intelligence Agency, and was also being paid by industrialists, both in the West and in India, to supply information, privileged and private information, from Nehru's confidential private office. So I think it's realistic and reasonable to assume that as he was feeding information to these agencies, they were directing him to feed the most important information coming across Nehru's desk for quite a protracted period of time. So I'm not saying that every single article that went across Nehru's desk was fed to the Central Intelligence Agency, but it appears that quite a lot of really important information, because Western intelligence had recruited Mathai as an agent, and he was at the center in a very close personal and working relationship with Jawaharlal Nehru. It seems likely that a lot of information was passed from Mathai to Western intelligence agencies, and that was supported by an inquiry that was held by the Indian government after Mathai left office, which sort of concluded the same thing, that it was highly likely that a huge amount of information had been passed, private, confidential, sensitive information had been leaked from Nehru's private office to Western intelligence agencies. So it's a sort of conclusion that's supported by an Indian government inquiry.
Would you then say that Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru was under pressure to involve the CIA in Indian matters, that he had to yield due to the war with China in 1962?
I think there is evidence that Nehru had a very conflicted and difficult relationship with Western intelligence agencies generally. So he had authorized the Intelligence Bureau, which was obviously India's primary intelligence agency before the formation of the Research Analysis Wing in September 1968. So the Intelligence Bureau in the 1940s, 50s and early 1960s was working with Western intelligence, both British intelligence and also the Central Intelligence Agency for the United States. And that was really because India required the sort of support in intelligence terms, particularly directed against China, that didn't at that point have the capacity to deliver internally. So Nehru was reluctant to work with Western intelligence agencies, and I think intelligence agencies generally, because he was quite suspicious about intelligence agencies having been subject to oppressive colonial surveillance prior to 1947. But he felt pragmatically that he had to do so because Indian national security, particularly against China, depended upon the information that Western intelligence agencies could supply India about Chinese military resources and intentions, particularly from the late 1950s onwards. I think the 1962 and the shock of the Chinese invasion of northern India, I think Nehru then authorized a more direct and comprehensive liaison relationship between Indian intelligence and the Central Intelligence Agency, again because Nehru was really wanted to draw on the resources that the Central Intelligence Agency could bring in terms of covert action against China, so disrupting Chinese military preparations along the Indian border, but also through the use of U-2 spy planes and other surveillance sort of methods that America had that India didn't have access to, that would give Nehru information on Chinese troop movements and Chinese intentions along the border. So yes, absolutely. I think after 1962, Nehru felt that Chinese aggression after 1962 really forced the Indian government to have a closer relationship with Western intelligence as the means of defending India from potentially future Chinese aggression.
What are your findings and what facts have you come across regarding the nuclear device that the CIA wanted to deploy on Nanda Devi? And do you really think that it was also in India's interest, or was it more exposure for India?
So yeah, that's a really complicated issue that I think Indian government. So this operation really began under Jawaharlal Nehru. It was authorized by Lal Bahadur Shastri when he took over from Nehru as prime minister after Nehru dies in 1964, and eventually Indira Gandhi as well authorizes that operation to continue. So at least 3 Indian prime ministers were aware of an operation that the Intelligence Bureau in India conducted jointly with the Central Intelligence Agency to place nuclear-powered monitoring devices on Nanda Devi, but also on Nanda Kot as well. In the Himalayas, and also actually into the later 1960s at another area of the Himalayas as well. So it was a comprehensive project to use American technical surveillance capabilities that happened to be nuclear powered, place them on Himalayan peaks, so they could peek over the Himalayas and look at Chinese nuclear test ranges and missile test ranges in Xinjiang, so just over the border. So again, the Indian government, I think, was conflicted in that relationship because on the one hand, it didn't really want to work with Western intelligence, because it compromised Indian sovereignty. On the other hand, it realized that China presented a real and present danger to Indian national security. So it felt it had to work with the Central Intelligence Agency to get the information about Chinese capabilities and intentions that it needed to have to guarantee Indian safety during that period. So there is there's a trade-off, a balance between the two. Was it in India's interests? Well, it did supply lots of really important intelligence about Chinese nuclear development and also Chinese missile technology, which the Indian military were very grateful to have. It also, however, created this contradiction where on the one hand, India is complaining about the Central Intelligence Agency interfering in the internal affairs of India and particularly India's political affairs by paying subsidies to Indian political parties and Indian politicians. But on the other hand, the Indian government is also working with the Central Intelligence Agency. I think the biggest issue is the lack of candor. So I think the biggest problem for India was the fact that the Indian government weren't open with the Indian parliament or the Indian people that they were conducting these operations with the United States. Had they been more open and transparent, then I think it wouldn't have been such a scandal when the revelations around the Nanda Devi operation became public in 1978. So I think there's an issue around transparency that was problematic, and it's sort of corroded trust between the Indian people and the Indian government because this relationship with the CIA was shown to be a lot more complicated. There is also the issue of using a nuclear device in the Himalayas as well. So the device on Nanda Devi was lost in a snowstorm, and it still to this day hasn't been recovered. So there's no radioactive leakage that's been detected in the Himalayan watershed and in the Ganga River. But nevertheless, that potential still exists. So environmentally, it could have been a potential disaster for India had the Himalayan watershed been contaminated by nuclear material in the 1960s or subsequently. So the Indian government was running a significant risk in that operation from an environmental perspective as well. Again, and that information wasn't shared with the Indian public.
I also want to go back to what you said about the CIA being involved in political matters here in India. Is it true? And is there enough evidence to support the claim that CIA was instrumental financially or otherwise in helping the Congress government destabilize the communist government in the state of Kerala in the 1950s?
Yes, I think there's quite conclusive proof now that the Central Intelligence Agency was working jointly with the Congress Party in the late 1950s, after the first communist government anywhere in the world, although it was only a state government, it was a national government, but a state government in India. The Communist Party of India was elected to the Kerala state legislature in 1957. And that really sent shockwaves across the West, and particularly in Washington. You have to remember, this is the height of the Cold War, when communism and capitalism are really fighting each other. So I think there was a push from Washington to try and remove that government from Kerala, that communist government in Kerala. But also the Congress Party was really worried about indigenous communism in India as well, and how that might gain traction and lead to civil disturbances in India. So both parties, the Congress Party and the CIA, had a common interest in removing the Communist Party from Kerala. And they did that unconstitutionally. So they did that undemocratically. They used covert action. They bribed trade union members to stoke up civil dissent. They organised marches and civil disruption in the state of Kerala. So both the Congress Party and the CIA used underhand methods really to try and destabilise the communist government in Kerala, and they were relatively successful in doing so. So absolutely, I think there is quite definitive evidence, and several US ambassadors, for example, have confirmed that the Central Intelligence Agency was active in Kerala at that time. Interesting, I think also British intelligence was active, which hasn't been as widely reported, but the British Secret Intelligence Service was also active in Kerala, doing similar sort of things around that time as well. So it wasn't just the Americans, the British were also involved in covert action through their intelligence services at that period. I guess it's also worth saying that, throughout the 1950s and early 1960s, the Central Intelligence Agency was giving funds to various political parties in India, the Congress Party amongst them, as a means of supporting candidates they thought would further American interests in India. But on the other side of that spectrum as well, the Russians and the KGB, particularly the Russian intelligence service, were doing exactly the same thing. So India became a sort of Cold War battleground between the United States and the Soviet Union, both of whom were covertly funding politicians and political parties in India that they thought would serve their interests.
Dr. McGarr, if we could speak about the present, do you believe that the CIA deliberately works at cross purposes against India despite all proclamations of intelligence sharing?
So I think ultimately the Central Intelligence Agency is an arm of the executive of the United States. It reports directly to the American president. And how the CIA is directed really depends upon how the current relationship between India and the United States is. I think the Trump administration, every intelligence agency, including India's Intelligence Agency Research Analysis Wing, are always trying to collect intelligence, both on the adversaries, so in India's case, China, but also on allies as well. So the notion that any country doesn't spy on its allies is a bit of a misnomer, I think. Intelligence agencies try to collect as much intelligence as they possibly can, both on adversaries and enemies, and also on allies, to give their governments what's called decision advantage, so to enable their governments to make better decisions. So, for example, a lot of economic intelligence takes place where intelligence agencies will try to learn the economic secrets of their allies and prominent companies within allied countries. So that intelligence goes on all the time, really. Everyone spies on everyone else, I think. I think the extent to which the CIA is spying in India really depends on the politics of the time. So if the relationship between India and the United States is particularly good, then CIA activity tends to be less sort of prominent than it would be if those strategic relationships came under points of tension. So I think just as the Research Analysis Wing probably conducts intelligence operations in the United States, it would be naive to think that the Central Intelligence Agency wasn't conducting intelligence operations in India to try and find out information that would be useful to the United States government. I think the level of those operations and the risk involved in them changes in relation to how good or bad those bilateral relations are between the United States and India at any given moment.
Paul McGarr, I'd like to thank you so much for taking the time out and speaking to us here at Times Now.